The first section begins by telling us that we are unknown to ourselves. Nietzsche's first concern seems to be self-examination. Although morality and religion are social phenomena, from the very beginning we see that Nietzsche is preoccupied by the individual. The social implications of religion and morality are what follow after its personal dimension. A couple of lines later, Nietzsche starts talking about someone who suddenly becomes self-aware at midday. We need to know that midday has symbolic significance in Nietzsche's philosophy. Just as Nietzsche talks about self-awareness and self-examination in this section of the book, in his Ecce Homo, he writes that his task is to prepare for humanity's moment of highest self-examination. A great noon when it will look back and look out, when it will escape from the domination of chants and priests, and for the first time pose the question why, the question what for as a whole. Now this is not an easy task, because as Nietzsche points out, we are not knowers when it comes to ourselves. In section 2, Nietzsche lets us know that in this book he is expanding on the ideas he had already proposed in his Human All Too Human. He says, "Let us hope that the long interval has done them good, that they have become riper, brighter, stronger, and more perfect." If you have listened to my analysis of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, you should know how important it was for Zarathustra to become ripe and mature. After all, that's why he goes into the mountains. Like Zarathustra, it takes Nietzsche and his ideas several years to become ripe. Nietzsche says these ideas did not arise in him randomly. They stem from a single root. Again, let's go back to his Ecce Homo to understand what he is talking about. Nietzsche believed his ideas stemmed from a single root, from an instinct. He says, "I have no sense of atheism as a result and even less as an event. For me, it is an instinct." We've talked about stemming from a single root and becoming ripe. Nietzsche continues with the metaphor of a tree. Our thoughts, values, every yes, no, if and but grow from us with the same inevitability as fruits born on the tree. Here we see the influence of Schopenhauer on Nietzsche. Schopenhauer believed that there is a metaphysical need in us. Given this need, Nietzsche recognizes the problem. It is inevitable to have moral values which philosophers base on metaphysics and ordinary people base on religion. In section 3, he writes, "I learned in time to separate theological from moral prejudice, and I no longer searched for the origin of evil beyond the world." This is comparable to what people like Feuerbach had tried to achieve prior to Nietzsche, namely, to explain religion in terms of this world. Such explaining is, of course, always a critical analysis of the otherworldly. For Nietzsche, this criticism was aided by his training in history and philology. Nietzsche never studies history for the sake of historical knowledge. Historical knowledge is always a means to an end, not the end itself. Dabbling in the criticism of the otherworldly led Nietzsche to develop certain questions, and he tells us, "To these questions I found and ventured all kinds of answers of my own. I distinguished between epochs, peoples, grades of rank between individuals. I focused my inquiry, and out of the answers there developed new questions, investigations, conjectures, probabilities, until I had my own territory, my own soil, a whole silently growing and blossoming world, secret gardens as it were, the existence of which nobody must be allowed to suspect." In section 4, Nietzsche reveals to us one of the methods he used to develop his own territory. He mentions a book titled The Origin of the Moral Sensations. This book is said to be the inspiration for writing on the genealogy of morality. Nietzsche says, I have perhaps never read anything to which I said no sentence by sentence and deduction by deduction as I did to this book, but completely without annoyance and impatience. Not only is this the method he used for writing this book, but Nietzsche often developed his ideas by saying no to what he read. This helped him find his own answers to the questions which troubled him. Earlier I mentioned Schopenhauer's influence on Nietzsche, but in section 5 it becomes clear that Nietzsche's task is completely different from that of Schopenhauer's. It turns out that for all his criticism of religion, Schopenhauer had an affinity for mysticism. Nietzsche saw this as a threat, and in many respects he was right to worry. In Europe, people have forgotten about Christianity, but they have replaced it with mysticism. This is for Nietzsche just a detour to nihilism. In section 6, we read what makes this book different from other critical books. We are told we need a critic of moral values. The values of these values should itself for once be examined. And so we need to know about the conditions and circumstances under which the values grew up, developed, and changed. This is a completely new approach. Nietzsche even talks about morality as symptom. This is what structuralists were doing in the 20th century, looking at phenomena as symptoms. Only Nietzsche had started this method several decades earlier. What is the big question which this book poses? People have taken the value of these values as given, as factual, as beyond all questioning. Up till now, nobody has had the remotest doubt or hesitation in placing higher value on the good man than on the evil. Higher value in the sense of advancement, benefit and prosperity for man in general, and this includes man's future. What if the opposite were true? The consequences of this can be horrific. This means that the present are living at the expense of the future. If this sounds familiar to you, it is because that's how the last human beings live. This turns people into the last human beings, a bunch of people who have no concern for the future and live in blissful ignorance for the present. In section 7, Nietzsche speaks of the day when we will be allowed to take the problems of morality cheerfully. He considers this cheerfulness to be a reward. He hoped for the day we could say, "Forwards! Even our old morality would make a comedy." Nietzsche didn't take this lightly. He even applied it to his own philosophy. In section 8, Nietzsche mentions his Zarathustra, but it might be interesting to point out that Thus Spoke Zarathustra is composed of 4 parts. Part 4, which concludes the book, has a comical tone. It seems that Nietzsche was such a firm believer in cheerfulness that he even took his own philosophy cheerfully.